Hey everyone, welcome to the podcast. I'm Mike Festa, and today I am happy to be joined with Jonathan Beals, who's done a lot of really interesting work over the years from companies like Nike to Adobe. I'm going to hand it over to him to give us a little background.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Again, it's such an honor to be here. Thank you so much for the invite. I've had just an incredible career that's really went from a failed attempt at being an aerospace engineer, and then realizing that what I really loved about that was the design component. So I went over to art school and then tried to get into film. And so I really was inspired by Lord of the Rings, sneaking into the Matrix before I was really too old for the Matrix. And then just being so inspired by those movies that I wanted to create that same experience for others. So I went into art school. I got a job within the commercial and film industry as a look development artist, modeler, lighting, compositing, anything that I could do. And then eventually, long story short, I realized that that industry wasn't for me. I had recently gotten married. That industry really requires some nomadic life, very unstable. But again, it's such a dream and such an incredible, amazing industry filled with incredible people. And so I needed to pivot roughly 11, 12 years ago. And in 2014, I pivoted into product at Nike. And so that started a decade long career over at Nike, where I started as a 3D designer and then really climbed the ranks to be the director of the virtual material studio, where we had our own design arm and our own production arm across footwear apparel. We had an innovation arm. So it was a really incredible experience. And now recently, I've transitioned over to Adobe as a senior solutions consultant, where I advise the top companies around the world on how to digitally transform their companies using cutting edge technology like Gen AI, like Substance, and some of those tools.
Yeah, that's awesome, Jonathan. Yeah, I love how your background kind of has, morphed and changed, but at the core of it is still this kind of visualization piece and, inspiring, people with imagery. And on the product side, Nike's been kind of a leader in this space for a while. How was that in 2014? Were they already like investing in 3D? And kind of where was it being used and how did you see that evolve?
Very surprisingly, they were investing in 3D way, is really Nike and, Adidas, with Nike really leading the way in a lot of regards. They early on had a very strong vision for 3D and digital product creation and how it could impact the entire product line, impact how long it takes to create footwear and apparel, right? On the apparel side too. The challenge and really the big difference here is the scope. Back in 2014, that footwear studio was under a dozen individuals, inclusive of management, and now it's over 100. And so they've over the last 10 years they've 10x'd it. And again, for reference, when we're talking about some of the other companies in here that are in the footwear apparel space that are smaller, it's less than a dozen for the entire org. And so they're really in a league of their own. And that started from a very early intent to be a disruptor and to drive completely different design parameters and ways of making shoes using cutting edge technology. And back then in 2014, we did not have the tools that we had today. It was Rhino and it was Maya, and it was a very slow and a very technical experience to be able to create these incredibly complex toolings and uppers and try and do it as fast as we could.
Yeah. Now, I imagine a lot of the design characteristics were more focused on the CAD and the manufacturability, maybe not as much on the visuals and the materials. I'm assuming that that's probably part of like your role as you've worked your way up, like was to basically try to incorporate a better looking visual material to eventually maybe use it in other things rather than just design, but also customer facing. You want to tell us a little bit about that journey?
Yeah, oh man, yeah. That was such a fun journey. So when I joined as a 3D designer, I jumped into the global football team, which is American soccer, and they were known as the premier category within Nike. So they had the best design reviews, they had the highest quality footwear. They were really a premier. category. And the reason that I joined that is because I did have a background in visualization and 3D rendering, and so they really were drawn to that capability and uplifting their uh, uh, pre visualization. And
Mhm.
back then, when we were doing this modeling and this design work, it was mostly almost 100% modeling and then 3D printing. They had a huge 3D printing capability even way back then, and that was really it. There was a little bit of visualization using tools like bunk speed, but there was really no visualization capability. There was no material scanning. There was no 3D visualization. There was no animation. There was nothing like that. So when I joined the global football team, I started to incorporate that into what we were doing, and it really just ignited this huge fire in everybody, and really being able to see the benefit in being able to do visualization before manufacturing. And so, with that knowledge, I saw a huge market opportunity in there to really drive some transformative change. So, a few years in, I started to pitch the idea to my executive team on how we could scale this and how we can incorporate the benefits of being able to do 3D color ups and colorways and being able to visualize everything before manufacturing, and completely failed hard so many times. And it was some really painful lessons, right? I'm sure you've been there. Like,
Sure.
deep in your core that what you're saying is right, and that you believe in it 100%, but you're not able to accurately communicate it and able to influence leaders to buy into your idea. And so I had to really learn at a young age to me, and not to others, on how to influence executives and how to speak their language and how to get out of my nerdy language and stop talking about spectral rendering and wavelengths and get into business jargon of KPIs. And eventually I found success, and they bought into the idea, and we got a few material scanners, and then we really start to scale up the visualization side, and we scaled up. On the production side, that was more focus on after the design has been manufactured and is more outward facing. And then we also at the same time scaled up on the design side on the footwear, and then we had a team that was separate from me that was really trying to figure out the apparel side with Clo, Browser, those types of tools, and scale that. And so that idea and benefit and the vision of the being able to visualize these accurately really took off, and it just saved just hundreds of millions of dollars over the years for Nike, and it had a profound impact. That and they're still moving forward with that vision today.
Yeah, no, that's amazing, and, yeah, I can relate to that kinda journey. I feel like I went through a similar process at Wayfair of moving from being, like, a, engineering technical person to really conveying, on the business side, the ultimate value, and it's challenging in an early adopter phase where you don't necessarily have those
Mhm.
metrics to kinda show what the ROI is gonna be, but it's more, somewhat intuition of, "Hey, we're doing it this way. This cost is here. We could potentially, produce all these other things," right? I think, talking about that
Mhm.
turnaround time internally as part of the design is an important, savings, as well as things like, you get the configurators now. You've got a lot more kind of flexibility and creativity utilizing that 3D content, but it's not always, I think obvious. And like you said, stumbling through, you'd run into these pain points of, oh, well, now we have a huge amount of content to create, right? You can do a small successful pilot relatively easily. But then as you think about like that scale factor, and, I could see why Nike would go 10x on this, right? They're seeing the investment pay off. And now it's like, well, we just need more people because we have so many products and so many different lines of, of things. Yeah,
Mhm.
that's awesome. So, kind of picking up on the material scanning piece, I know you guys did an interesting collaboration with HP, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about the Z-Captus and how that journey went from kind of initial prototyping to they have a final consumer product out there now. Then it integrates with Adobe Substance, so you can maybe use that as a chance to jump into your Adobe role as well.
Yeah, I would love to, and that is such a phenomenal device. And it's been so interesting being attached to that for a while now, and seeing that collaboration with HP and Adobe from both sides, and just the incredible talent that goes into building something like that, and the evolution of that, and how ideas and user requirements and user needs changes and morphs over the time. You know, it takes a really long time to build something like this. And when you're doing that, there's much of market risk and trends change, technology changes. And so there's a lot of changes that needed to happen and be incorporated with that device as it matured and got closer to market. And you know, when we look at the core technology, most material scanners, aside from the Tac 7, all operate the same. You have one point, you know, camera that's on the top, you have your lights. Some of them have the polarization, some don't, and that's one of the things that, of course, sets aside the Captus device is the polarization. And so, essentially, how these device works is you take thousands and thousands of photographs with different light configurations, polarization on, polarization off, and that allows you to extract height information and diffuse color and specular information. And so then that can be all combined together. And that technology hasn't really changed very much in a long time. It's all very it's the same sort of philosophy and the same sort of point of view. But what they did do is they wrapped in an exceptional user experience around the whole device. And so they started that with the design configuration, right? So it's got the dome, it's not a box. And it's got the pull-out drawer and how you configure it. But I think one of the aspects that truly sets it apart from other competitors on the industry is its ecosystem. And the majority of material design, material appearance is created within the Substance suite, and so now they have this scanning device that plugs directly into Sampler, directly into Designer, and now you're in this ecosystem that works effortlessly together, and that's a big difference than anything else, and that's really solves one of the primary challenges that we as 3D designers and artists have is when we create these materials and models, we have to jump between all sorts of different software. And every time we do that, it's just a pain in the neck to move from one software to the other just to visualize, and information gets lost or deleted. And so this solves a huge pain point for a lot of individuals and keeping that contained in its ecosystem and allowing you to retain the ability to edit and crop and really fine tune it on how you want to do it. And so that's a big benefit here. And you know, there other than that, you know, it's got similar um, resolution and similar, you know, physical size to some of the other devices out there. And so I think one of the things that we need to be looking at here in the future with this device and others is because that technology hasn't changed so much. What is going to set Captus or other devices apart? What's really going to propel that industry? Because you have things like the Tech 7 that are incredibly accurate, that can actually fit your material scan to your BRDF information, right? So you can fit it to your GGX.
Mhm.
uh, the consequence of that is it's extremely slow, it's extremely low resolution, and, you know, it's hard, again, to port that information out of it, and so I think that's where AI is going to have a profound impact here on the material scanning, information, especially with the billions and billions of different data sets out there, is to be able to train it on, the source material and then what it should look like, and being able to accurately fit material, appearance to that initial capture data that's a lot faster to acquire than something with a TAC. And so that's where I think Adobe here is going to see really interesting times is because they are pushing really hard on AI and incorporating it into a lot of their products. And so that could be a big benefit that we see here as they continue to evolve this material scanning landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. I know it's interesting you mentioned the technology goes way back, like at Wayfair, and this is probably a good 6, 7 years ago. We were using like Adobe Substance Designer and feeding in, images with basically different shadow information. So a little, less sophisticated and rigorous and is taking thousands of photos. We'd usually take like either 4 or 8 with the different, lighting directions coming in, and then we'd be able to generate at least normal maps and pretty good diffuse maps. But we weren't doing like specular and all these other additional things that sounds like these newer machines are capable of, which is pretty exciting. But yeah, I
Mhm.
love the whole workflow and just the kind of click button, get the content, and then you can proof it right there while you still have the physical sample. So I think that's that type of workflow is important for folks. I'm curious, as we're kind of talking about scanning, this was specific to material scanning. How do you think about like 3D scanning and maybe photogrammetry? Did you guys incorporate that a lot, or because let's say at Nike specifically, the shoe was already probably designed in 3D, so maybe you didn't have as much of a need for scanning the physical sample? I know like shoes come in all different sizes and designs and styles. And so we, for example, did a project with Google where we scanned like 300 different pieces of footwear. They were not your traditional like sneaker. They were more, shiny boots or strappy things or stuff with sparkles and glitter. We were trying to like go for the harder products. But how do you think about like photogrammetry versus CAD, specifically in the footwear space?
Yeah. Yeah, it's so photogrammetry, has an incredibly special part within the footwear pipeline, and footwear is miraculously difficult to model. It's this combination of soft and hard surface modeling, and it's really easy to get it to look not accurate or to
Mhm.
get the foot form wrong, and a lot of design teams will start with the last, which is, basically a footwear shape that the shoe is manufactured around. It's very sleek. But when you design around that, uh, it doesn't look real and it looks very CAD like. And so, one of the best solves for this is to actually do a photogrammetry of the footwear shape that you're approximating or that you want to work around, and then model around that or create a really low res base model around that. And then what you can do is you can then flatten that and then model model on top of that. And then that allows you to have this really simple base form that you can do this really complex modeling and have it look accurate. And then especially on the production side, photogrammetry is incredibly important because then you can essentially retopology and rebuild that and know that it is accurate and true to life. Because that's incredibly important, especially when you have things that are marketplace focus, and is that it has to be accurate, or there's liabilities on that if that product isn't accurate. And so that was a key tool, especially in external facing audiences, that we started with a photogrammetry base. Since then, there's been a lot of incredible technology with nerfs and Gaussian and splats that have really hit the scene that are completely shaking up that industry and what that means. And that's also true for material scanning too. So there's companies, there's like MXR, where you can scan the geometry and the material at the same time and have a realistic appearance. And
Mhm.
that is going to be just a really, really fascinating capability in here, because there's some materials and some geometry that you can't get a flat swatch of. And being able to have that capability and that realism is going to be incredibly important, especially in the Gaussian splat and the nerf space of being able to have the real time ray tracing. um, can potentially just save so much money for these companies if they don't have to modify it after the fact and they just need this realistic version of this asset. That could be a really powerful way to incorporate it, especially if you're doing immersive realities or games and needing background characters and objects. That's a pretty powerful combination there, and I think a huge direction that the industry is going as well. And we've seen some fantastic, even music videos that are starting to incorporate this technology in them, and the space is really exploding right now.
Yeah, no, I'm excited about it. It's a topic we've covered a little bit, in the show, and I'm sure we're going to continue to talk about it a lot more. One thing that's interesting, or I'd like to get your opinion on at least, is how about like colorways, right? So if we're capturing something and it's like a splat, how do you think about, maybe identifying individual components and potentially like changing those out for different styles? Is that something you've seen done well yet? Or, AI can probably come in and solve it someday, but what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I haven't seen it done terribly well yet. I've seen a few creators out there that are able to accomplish it in certain ways, but the workarounds and the hacks to do it are pretty laborious. So it's still in the very much the curiosity and exploration stage, and not practical for real world usage.
Mhm.
But this is definitely a space that's prime for AI, right? So you have different parts of your shoe. They're all you know, naming, there should be standards on what parts are named. It's surprising how it's not, but there should be standards. So you have your
Yeah.
swoosh, you have your medial, your lateral, your laces. And then if you can get the AI to identify those parts and what they look like and the shapes, then being able to automatically um, mask those off and have the parts their own parts, then you can get really, really far, and being able to do some really interesting things with G splats and some other technology. The challenge here again is like changing the color to be realistic, right? So, like,
Mhm.
some nerdy technology here is if you like the color you're seeing, it's not actually the color of the object, right? It's the color that's reflecting after all the other colors are absorbed into it. And then you also have this compounding effect of when the wavelengths of light hit the material, they scatter differently based off of the color of the material. And so even when you spectrally scan that color, you have this spectral distribution of how that color and the wavelengths sit, and that whole thing changes the appearance of the material itself. And so changing the color changes the appearance, which can have an effect on your specular levels and all sorts of things. And
Oh,
so like
wow.
we th- we think like being able to separate the color from the object is easy and intuitive, and like it couldn't be further from the truth. Like it doesn't happen in the real life. And so we're breaking physics here. And so it's a really challenging concept to be able to replace a color accurately and have it look true to form. So as a very simple example, if you have a very bright fluorescent green on a suede versus a leather, even if you're using that same chemical process, they're going to look completely different. The suede is going to look like pea soup and it's going to look gross. The leather's going to look great,
Mhm.
but
Yeah.
it's the same color. But when you scan it post fact, like they're different values, because of how things are being absorbed and how the chemical processes interact with material. And so that's a big challenge for these companies because they're like, this is our source of truth for the color. I want that on all these different types of substrates. And then you do it, and in the real or in the digital world, everything looks perfect. But then you manufacture it and you have this complete variations. And that's a big problem in the footwear space because then you have two different materials on a footwear product. You put the same color on it, they look great and the same, but then you manufacture it and how the wavelengths interact with it changes the color. And now it doesn't look good. And so that's a big problem to try and accurately solve um, within the context of the 3D space is how do you take a source of truth color and then correctly transpose it and limit its gamut and all sorts of other things in a realistic fashion.
Yeah.
And that hasn't really been solved effectively that I've seen.
Yeah, no, that's super fascinating. The whole color theory and screen calibration, all these things, it's like a super deep topic. But I do wonder if maybe, with some of these scanning technologies, if we were able to physically capture the material and then relate it to some of the digital information, you give it
Hmm.
enough AI training data, and then maybe there's some, AI process that can help like translate that. So yeah, super
Oh,
fascinating.
oh,
And
100%. Yeah.
yeah, interesting topic. As we're kind of getting, we have about 7 minutes left. I want to kind of hit on two more topics, like one, advice, and then two, the future. But maybe let's just start with advice. Like, what advice do you have for folks, especially like brands that are looking to get into 3D and they're still trying to figure out like where to start? Like, do they build it in house? Do they partner with an external team? Like, what's a good place to start?
Yeah. Yeah, so right now, DPC is in this weird space where it's relatively new to a lot of companies, and it's been done quite well by a lot of companies for a long time. And we look at IKEA. IKEA's probably had one of the premier 3D pipelines forever, as long as I can remember. I mean, you look at their catalog, and I don't even know if anything in that catalog is real anymore. I mean, it's just an
Yeah.
astounding, sounding like. I mean, it's just like, and same like with a lot of other companies. You look at their catalog, and you'd be surprised at how much is 3D. The challenge is, I mean, IKEA is really good about this, but the challenge with this is companies like Nike and others is they're completely closed off on sharing their process and what it takes to scale a 3D team. So it's really hard to learn from those that are doing it. And so my advice would be to essentially try and stand on the shoulders of giants and duplicate what has been done at other companies. And easy as that sounds, that's extremely challenging because a lot of these companies are it's really hard to have them divulge some of this information. But there's um, so that's a challenge. The other challenge is a lot of the talent that's coming into this industry come from games and film. We've seen just a huge crash in those markets, tons and tons of layoffs right now. So there's a lot of incredible talent here that's hungry to get into product,
Mhm.
and they don't have a lot of that product experience and that back. They've got really amazing, amazing experience on the pipeline side. So it'd be really easy for these companies to hire directly from these other industries to build a pipeline. But film and game pipelines are just completely different than product pipelines, and so that's something to go into this with um, is you want to leverage what's been done with other product companies, and really utilize a lot of those skill sets that fit your unique workflows, and be careful on who you hire and how you hire. And like we've seen Nike get in a lot of trouble with this with consultants, right?
Mhm.
And really like hurting brand integrity. And so there's an inclination um for to be able to hire, some of the larger consultant companies. And there's a danger in that as well. And so hiring some of these smaller consultancy groups or ones that are focused specifically on 3D digital transformation is more effective route than trying to go to like a big McKinsey or something like that. And so I would really look into that, and then looking at trying to get some of these 3D designers and individuals that have done this at other product companies and hiring them and starting with that if you're large enough to get that going, and then really leveraging their expertise and their knowledge and how to scale.
Nice. Yeah, I'd say that's similar to like what we were trying to do at Wayfair. We did end up bringing in a lot of folks from this like kind of like entertainment space, and kind of retaught them. We built out a curriculum internally as well for this kind of artist training, and so part of our onboarding process would be kind of learning about some of the characteristics of like the brand integrity and imagery, and like
Mm.
there's different categories, within a large organization like Wayfair. We'd have different specialties, you'd have different product categories, you'd have different, brands, and each of those had their own little nuances. But I did find that generally, these folks are pretty quick to pick that up. And, they may not have had the product experience in their previous work, but it only takes, a couple weeks really for them to get comfortable and familiar with the output,
Oh yeah.
and they're able to kind of, merge into this kind of product world pretty quickly, which is exciting. The other kind of plug I'll put out there is some work we're doing at Kronos, the asset creation guidelines. So we're trying to make it easier for technical artists to kind of understand like what's the best practices for representing products. It's more catered towards like a GLTF workflow and output, but I'd say in general, it's kind of like real time PBR is our focus, and helping folks kind of like wrap their head around what are the different materials and different effects and different extensions that are possible to produce, pretty photorealistic like content, especially in the real time context. I've been impressed to see how that's transformed over the last even 5 years, to get to a point where I think we're going to see maybe merged pipelines, and you're not going to necessarily need like a rendering workflow and a real time workflow. You'll have like a fused version, and tools like Adobe Substance are really helping like bridge that gap. So that's been exciting to see.
That's
I'm gonna
amazing.
hand it to you to kind of wrap things up with your predictions of the future. Where do you see this kind of technology going? We talked a little bit about some of the AI, places that it can help scanning. But just as a wrap up, like how do you see 3D evolving over the next, let's say, 5 years?
Yeah. Yeah, we're we're gonna see such a change in this industry that's really unlike any change ever before. We look at historical tools like Maya, right? And I like fundamentally Maya just did not change by leaps and bounds in 10 years. In the last decade, you essentially model the same, you approach the geometry the same. You have new effects, new capabilities, but fundamentally you approach it the same. And same with Max, and same with a lot of these other software tools, ZBrush. I think that's really going to get disrupted here in the next few years, with a lot of these more bespoke tools and different ways to model and democratizing the capability. It's really going to bring down the barrier to how complex it is to create these models, and that's historically been one of the primary reasons why product companies haven't fully adopted 3D is because it's been so extremely technical and challenging to build. And it still takes a while to build a fully functional, fully realistic 3D shoe. And I think that's really going to start to change, especially with the advent of AI and some of these more complete agentic tools. That are going to bring down that barrier for others to be able to enter and storytell, and it's also going to really change where you use 3D, right? And so, like, right now, we're doing a lot of 3D at the early concept stage, but I think that's starting to really get eroded away with AI, and as AI continues to, take some of that footing away and being able to edit, y the second that you can control AI and be able to, change design lines and change color lines, that's going to take a huge chunk from 3D away, and they're really going to have to pivot, and understand where is the best point to utilize 3D. And it's really
Mhm.
that one to many. Once you have that 3D object, then you can go to the marketplace and you can do all sorts of turntables and animations and AR, VR. So there's still a lot of wonderful benefits of it. But it's really going to shift where that benefit is and how that is created, who creates it, what tools they use. A lot of these traditional tools with polygon modeling are going to become obsolete in the next few years. And it's going to be a lot of different, we're seeing some disruption with Gravity Sketch and some other tools. And once we figure out some of the complexities of standardization of UVs and textures and material scanning and those things, then, anyone's going to be able to do a photogrammetry on their phone and be able to have everything parted out with the materials and the textures and all the information in there with good topology and really be able to design and create. And I've seen some glimpses into some alpha stage tools right now that are really starting to incorporate 3D and AI. And when we even look at some of the public stuff from Viscom and being able to design in 2D and then automatically create a 3D object. And as AI improves and as that fitting improves, soon you're going to be able to sketch in 2D and have a fairly decent model in just a couple hours of practice instead of a couple weeks.
Yeah, no, it's exciting, I think, from a creative standpoint, because I see these tools evolving in a way that makes us faster, more efficient, and able to create like better content in a shorter period of time versus, oh, we're just going to spit in a machine and it's going to automatically do everything for us. Because, to your
Mhm.
point, like there's like so many like, distinct things, like even the color variations, right, that still take that kind of creative eye. And I think the design tools getting faster and more efficient is super exciting, and I love to see the development and the progress, and hope you'll keep us up to date with the latest happening at Adobe. And yeah, this was great chatting with you. Thanks again
Yeah,
for joining
likewise.
us. And
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on.
all right, awesome. We'll see you all next time. Thanks.